Hey there, my name is Daniel. Welcome to our little podcast. Today's guest is Philip Mantle, who is a book author and UFO researcher for more than 30 years. His great books have been published in 9 countries so far and are available in 5 different languages. Today, he's here with me and we talk about UFOs, aliens, and of course his work as a UFO researcher. And we also talk about his latest book, UFO Landings UK. And guys, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a like and a subscription. And share this podcast with all your friends. And for those of you who speak and understand German, please check out our German podcast project Sagenhaft und Sonderbar also. I will leave a link in the description. You can show some love by leaving a like, a comment or a subscription there also. And if you have a story that you want to share with us, please send us an email. The link is also in the description. Philip, we had a talk before, but our video was deleted by a vicious cyber attack not too long ago. I'm glad you took the time to talk to me again. And if you don't mind, give us a little insight in who is Philip Mantle and what the hell is he doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I was just an ordinary schoolboy like everybody else, went to a normal school. I was born and raised in a coal mining community. My father worked down the coal mine all his life. But one thing I had different from my friends, we had some interests similar, we like football, we like comic books, like the movies. But the one thing growing up that I was different was that I liked all things paranormal. And I would read whatever I could lay my hands on, watch the occasional TV show when they were a broadcast. And for example, literally right over the road from where I lived when I was about 14 was my best friend's grandmother. And she used to go to a local town. I live in West Yorkshire in the north of England, just outside of the city of Leeds. And she went to the Spiritualist church. So I went along with her a couple of times, found it fascinating, but didn't necessarily agree with everything. I'm also the type of chap who would always ask questions and always raise my hand. And, that used to get me in trouble at school at times because some of the things they would teach knew that this is what happened. And I would raise my hand and say, well, what about this or what about that? So the same applied in the field of the paranormal. And then I was also interested in astronomy. And I remember, again, I was around, my teenage years. I read a book on astronomy that had one chapter in it, Daniel, about UFOs, basically dismissing them, which I found rather odd. But that lit the fuse. So I left school with no qualifications. And that was 1974. Took on a couple of jobs, but I always had this get out of jail card. My interest in these subjects was growing. And then in the winter of 1978, over into 1979, I worked in what was your country, West Germany, as it was at the time. I worked there for about 4 months. Couldn't speak a word of the language. How is it, Daniel, when you go to a foreign country and you can't speak the language? The first 2 things you learn is how to order a beer and how to swear. But what I did while I was there, I phoned my mum and said, can you send me some books to read, Mum? Because even though we had a TV, I couldn't understand any of it, really. So she sent me a box of books and they were all on UFOs. So I read the lot. When I returned home in 1979, my interest in the subject had grown. We then had the Spielberg movie Close Encounters come out. I saw that. And my aunt, who lived around the corner, she used to buy a local newspaper. It was actually published in Leeds. And she brought the paper around one evening, and there in it was a small advertisement. That Sunday, coming up, was the formation of what was called the Yorkshire UFO Society. It was their first meeting. So I caught the bus, went into Leeds. I didn't drive at that point, found this place. There were about 20 or 30 people there, and it had been formed by two brothers, Mark and Graham Birdsall. And they'd obviously been involved in UFO research already for a few years. And they put on a presentation. And Daniel, that was it. I was hooked. I felt, you know, I don't know if you've ever had that feeling, you're just feeling you're in the right place at the right time. They also had a massive table of books, which was great because they were hard to find anyway. I paid my membership fee, which I think then was about £2 for the whole year, you know, and that's how it all began, and I went from there.
You have been to Germany, you told me before. That's great. And yeah, it all started with books. Do you remember who wrote those books?
No, I don't. I mean, books at that point where we live on UFOs were hard to come by. I think my mother got them on the market, you know, all second-hand paperbacks. You know, I think it was fantastic. And I didn't keep them. I didn't bring them back home with me because I couldn't fit them in my luggage to bring them home. So they got left behind in Germany somewhere, you know. But it, you know, I don't. It increased my passion for the subject. When I came home, I wanted to know more. I didn't really know what I was going to do. And then I saw the movie of Close Encounters. I thought, oh, and then the formation of the Yorkshire UFO Society all seemed to be like fate, almost all the pieces falling at the right time. And when I joined the Yorkshire UFO Society, not only was it the right place, it was the right time, Daniel, because as we went over into the 1980s, we then started to get a lot of reports coming in. So if you wanted to be an investigator, there wasn't a better time. And that's exactly what, by this time, what I wanted to do. I mean, we used to have meetings every month on a Sunday, and you could just sit there and listen to the latest news. You didn't have to get involved, but that wasn't good enough for me. I wanted to know more. My hand was still going up like it used to do at school. I was reading everything I could, and I was off and running.
Did you sign the books back then? But because if so, I will look out on the Hamburg flea market.
No, they were all paperbacks. They came in like a big shoebox, a cardboard shoebox. My mother wrapped them in brown paper and sent them to me. I just asked for books. I didn't ask for anything specific. It was my mother's decision to buy these books, not mine, because I used to read novels. I would read science fiction. I would read horror stories. I just wanted to sit down on an evening and be able to read something, because there was nowhere where we lived that I could buy English books. And to my amazement, they were all on UFOs, which was great, you know, and God rest her, she's no longer with us, is my mum, but she, you know, she helped her with the interest in the subject.
So she guessed that you might like them.
Well, she already knew of my interest, and I'd already, you know, read a couple of books, and I talked to my mother a little bit about it. Mm-hmm. Although she wasn't an educated lady, she still had a good brain on her, and so she must have realised that my son's getting in. She may have just come across them by coincidence and thought they were cheap. You know, they may have been cheaper than some of the other books. I don't know. But I'm forever grateful that they arrived when they did. Yeah. And it you know, it lit the spark even further.
Yeah. Everything happens to the right time.
Mm.
Everything has its time, and that was your time.
Yeah.
Get those books.
Yeah. I mean, had I not gone to work in West Germany at that time, that would probably never happen.
Of course.
So it's Germany's fault that I'm involved.
Guilty. That's good. Let's make a big step forward. Of course, you heard about the congressional UFO hearing in the US.
Yes.
Any deeper thoughts on this one?
Well, I mean, we have to look at it on the positive side, because it's the first hearings in 50 years. So let's take the positives out of it. The one thing, I watched the hearing when it was broadcast. You didn't learn an awful lot from it, but it's a start. So I don't think we should be too negative. However, you kept hearing the word, defense. So I'm if I put my cynical head on, are they trying to just raise some more money for the defense budget in the United States? The trillions that they already spend perhaps is not enough. They want even more. But that's been a bit cynical. They've made certain statements, and we'll see how those progress, see if they back up those claims, those statements, because, there is a growing movement that won't let their local representatives off the hook. And if they don't deliver, there will be an outcry from the UFO community in the United States, and that will lead to them pestering their own, representatives and so on. And but let's hope for the best.
Yeah.
What will come out of it? Who knows? Yeah.
For now, it's great that it happened.
Yes,
and that's a good thing.
Well, what it does, Daniel, of course, it certainly in the States and here, it puts the UFO subject into the mainstream. Yeah. And this all began with the New York Times article back in December 2017, of course. And it's all stemmed from that. So let's hope it continues in that vein. And I speak to journalists fairly regularly. I think there will always be the one that likes the sensational stories and things like that, but that's their job, But there are many others that saying, well, what about this, Philip? What about that? They're trying to take it more serious. Perhaps like they did sort of mid-1990s was similar, because that's when people like Dr. John Mack stepped out of the shadows and went on and said, there is something to this phenomena. And I met John several times, a lovely guy. So when you have a Harvard professor and a Pulitzer Prize winning writer saying, hold on a minute, I'm staking my reputation here, there is something that we're missing, then you've got to take notice. He wasn't some lunatic. And so now we have a similar thing, but it's not a person. It's actually the US authorities are standing up and saying, well, we think there may be something to this, but we're just not sure what it is. So we're going to look into it, and we'll wait and see what happens.
Yeah. I'm guessing you mentioned Avi Loeb when you said the Harvard professor, and I'm very excited, and I can't wait to see what he will discover with this Galileo project.
The only thing about the Galileo project, as far as I'm aware, it's not all scientists that are involved in it. There are some UFO researchers as well. So that may let him down somewhat. But again, you have a well-respected, physicist, astrophysicist saying that I think there is extraterrestrial life, and we may be able to detect it, and it may well be, here or there or whatever. And of course, we've just had the first images from the James Webb Space Telescope, which were absolutely amazing. They don't surprise me, because I'd already been told how large the visible universe was, but to see it in picture format was amazing. Yeah. And so that indirectly may help as well.
Are you familiar with the Sky 360 program?
No, I'm not. No.
Okay, it's too much to put it in here, but I will send you some information on this one. It's actually the same in a little bit smaller.
That's okay.
I will send you some information about this one. Yeah, you told me you were already interested in astronomy as a kid. Mm-hmm. And NASA is showing us great and sometimes even strange pictures from Mars. For example, that, let's call it, door that looked as if it was machined into the wall of rock. Another picture showed us a rock that looked almost like a femur of a big animal. Exciting, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I go back to when the Mariner missions to Mars, when they landed on Mars in the 70s. And at the time, there was a lot of speculation and even disagreement that the experiments that the Mariner landed, that they actually found life, but microbial life, albeit. And I've always believed that life on Mars did exist. I don't think it's there now. I don't think it was anything too sophisticated either. I think some of these images that we see now, you know, natural formations of rocks and riverbeds, they can be eroded to look like a whole host of things, but they're not. They are, at the end of the day, just rock. It's like you look into the clouds, you can see faces in them, you know, but there's no faces there. So it's the same type of thing. However, if you go back to when Bill Clinton was the president of the United States, NASA had uncovered a meteorite from Mars. I don't know if it was at the North Pole or the South Pole, but they recovered this meteorite, and it had a name. And Bill Clinton almost said it proved life existed elsewhere, because in this rock was what we call a microfossil. So it was fossilized bacteria. But bacteria is life regardless. Now, we had an astronomer called Sir Fred Hoyle, and I read his book many, many years ago. It's called The Intelligent Universe. And that's exactly what he was talking about, Sir Fred, was these, you know, meteorites from all over the place. When you examine them, there were these very tiny little imprints in them, and they were actually fossilized bacteria. So life, in his opinion, is part and parcel of the universe, you know, as simple as that. Now, some of it will remain as bacterial life, some of it will die out. However, some of it may advance as well, pretty much like you and I. So I'm confident that if we look at some of the features that we know about on Mars, then at some point on Mars, liquid water was present. And what we know on Earth, where there's water, there's life. It is a simple calculation. And I think the same would be no matter whether you were on Mars or any other planet. If you have liquid water and it's there long enough, you will have life. The water's now gone, so the life may have gone with it, but something was there. And I think the only way we'll conclusively get anywhere with that, Dan, was if we actually send people, you know, manned. The various missions that they've had there and the rovers and what have you have done a fantastic job, but they haven't got the thing that they need, which we all have, every one of us has, and that's curiosity.
Yes.
You know, you can't build that into a robot. So if you're standing on Mars and you look at something and and then your curiosity clicks in, you think, hang on a minute, I'll just go and have a look, and then hey presto. So I don't think we'll conclusively prove that life has existed and may even still exist, but it won't be anything like you or I. We shall see.
I have the same opinion. As a musician, I would love them to find an instrument of some kind. That would be great. That would be great. And it would be great to know that ETs also love music, just like us. I talked to Eric von Däniken about this one. He used to play harmonica, just like me. And we talked about the subject. And he said, yeah, I think there is music.
What did Spielberg use in his movie Close Encounters? He used lights and music.
Yeah.
You know, because music is also mathematical, and math. You know, mathematics is universal. 2 + 2 will always equals 4, no matter where we are in the universe. And music is also, you know, based on mathematics. So there you go. Why not?
Of course. Let's talk a little bit about your book, UFO Landings UK. The title of the book is actually self-explanatory, but tell us what made you decide to write this book.
It's very apt you ask this question, Daniel, and I'll explain why in a second. As I told you, I joined this newly formed Yorkshire UFO Society. And in the 80s, we were very busy. Lots of sightings coming in. And I was in my local newspaper, and they ran my telephone number. This lady rang me. Like I said, at that point in time, the whole area where I live all used to be mines. It was all coal mines. She lived just a few miles away in a small town called Normanton. And it was a coal mining town. And she said, Philip, you won't believe me. Won't believe me. Well, try me. So she was called Mrs. Westerman. And myself and my colleague from UFOs, Mark Birdsall, went to interview her. She told us a story. She said she lived in a terraced house with no houses opposite. And it was also a cul-de-sac. So there was no through road at the end. At the bottom of the road were some trees, a small stream and a hill with some electricity pylons on. So a lovely sunny day, and her children and their friends were playing outside in the street, playing a ball game. And it was just after lunch because Mrs. Westerman was washing the dishes. One of the children rushes in and he says, Mom, there's an aeroplane crashed in the field. So she goes out, and because it was an elevated house, you'd go up like 6 or 7 steps to get in the front door. She could see out over this hill. She said, Philip, it wasn't an aeroplane. It was something on the ground that was shaped like a Mexican hat. So she got the kids, of which there was 6, and she took them down. We went through the trees, down across the stream, and you lose sight of this hill at that point. And you come up the other side, and this hill used to, this field, it had a fence around it. And they stopped at the fence. This object was still there, but now there were 3 very tall men out in front of it. They had like a white boiler suit on. They didn't have an astronaut's helmet on. They had something covering their face. And 2 of them were waving something over the ground. One of the children tried to climb the fence, and Mrs. Westerman held him back. And these 3 men walked to the rear of this thing. It lifted up completely silently, stopped in midair, and then shot off at an angle. And we interviewed Mrs. Westerman and her children. And, you know, they were completely bamboozled by it, Daniel. They had no idea what this was. She expected, because it's a busy little town, is Normanton. There's a big motorway called the M62, runs right past it, thousands of cars an hour. She thought it'll be on the TV news tonight. This, nothing in the newspaper, you know. And what is curious, what is nice about this case, that what it did, it proved to me, Daniel, that I wasn't wasting my time in this subject, because pretty much all the things I'd read were in America or somewhere else. This was 5 miles from where I lived. This was in my own backyard. Mrs. Westerman's husband was a coal miner. The children played the same ball game I played when I was their age. These were the type of people I'd grown up with, you know, in this environment. So we weren't allowed to use a name, couldn't take a photograph, didn't want any publicity. So you have 2 things. They're either lying or telling the truth. And I couldn't find any reason why they would be lying. What is interesting is just before the COVID pandemic, I did an interview with somebody on a podcast, can't remember who it was, and I told them about this story. But I forgot to use the lady's name. So a couple of weeks later, I got an email from a lady in New Zealand. She says, hello, my name's so-and-so. I used to live in the town of Normanton when I was younger. What was the lady's name? So I replied, it's Mrs. Westerman. She says, my best friend when I lived in Normanton was called Westerman, and I'm still in touch with her. I'll ask her. So she emailed her friend, and her friend was one of those children I'd interviewed all those years ago. So she put me in touch with her, and she says, I can remember it. And she gave me a statement. We had arranged to meet up, but then the pandemic came. So that was the end of that. But literally just last week, I'd done a TV show here that had gone out. And a gentleman emailed me and he said, my partner was one of those children at Normanton. Now, I never mentioned Normanton on this TV show. It was all about Roswell. So he gave me the phone number and I rang her up she was one of the children there, but she wasn't a relative of Mrs. Westerman. She was one of the children's friends. And she was 8 years old at the time. She told me the whole story. I spoke to her on the phone because she lives a long way from here now. And she remembered it like it was yesterday. And the young lady I spoke to in just before the pandemic, they were best friends. So I was able to give them each other's email and put them in touch. And hopefully they will have made contact, without any interference from me. So I'd been looking for these children for years. Obviously, the lady I spoke to first, her name wasn't Westerman anymore because she got married. The other lady I spoke to wasn't called Westerman because she was just one of the children's friends, and she doesn't live locally anyway. And I have on my notepad in front of me all the notes I was taking while I was speaking to her. So I have reconfirmed that first landing case from all those years back by speaking to two of the children who are now grown up. And I found it astonishing, and I was forever thankful that they got in touch.
That's a great story. And it's very interesting when people see this stuff, and people like this, especially.
Well, Mrs. Westerman was extremely puzzled, not only by the sighting, but why apparently nobody else had seen it. Because she lived in, it was a sunny day, everybody's out and about. Like I said, there's a big motorway goes right past. It was a busy little town, still is. And I think at one point she even went and asked a couple of her neighbors. So that puzzled her, not almost as much as seeing the thing. And I don't have any answers for that. All I can say is I believe exactly what they say. And then to have confirmation all these years later by two of the children now grown up. And there were 6 of them. So there's 4 others out there somewhere. Maybe I'll find them eventually. You never know. We shall see. But what it did, it confirmed that I wasn't wasting my time in UFO research. But it also then implanted in me an interest in these particular type of cases. So landing cases became like a private research project for me. I would just collect them and put them in a file, and then I'd add another one. The book itself, UFO Landings UK, I've been meaning to write it for several years now, but when the pandemic came, I had no excuse then, Daniel, because I couldn't go anywhere. So I sat down and wrote it. And actually, if someone buys a copy, they'll see the publication date is 2 years ago. Because we also got interest from a TV company to do a documentary about it. So we were going to publish the book and the documentary at the same time, but the pandemic came. So I decided to publish the book now, and the TV documentary is done, but I don't know when they'll actually broadcast it. So that'll come later. But it was just, some of the, I forgot some of the cases I had, to be honest, Daniel. It's only when I'm pulling them out of my files and going through them again, thinking, oh boy, I'd forgotten about this one. And, as many of the people as I could, I tried to interview myself as well. It wasn't possible because some of the cases were historical cases, or they were, we'd lost track of the witnesses and so on. But where I could, I would always try and go physically and speak to the individuals myself. And hey presto, UFO Landings is out and up and running. But it all began in reality, although I didn't know it at the time, with that first landing case we investigated all those years back in Normanton in West Yorkshire. And here we are today, come full circle.
It's an interesting case, and it's strange, like you said, that nobody saw it besides her. Yeah. And maybe somebody picked her out to witness this, and nobody else. Reminds me of, she's not alone.
She's not alone in this. This is something that happens on a regular basis.
Yeah,
it's almost as if you have to be at that time and at that place to see this. apparition or this UFO or whatever it may be. And they all saw it. You know, there was 7 of them in total. And what is also interesting, they never called it a spaceship or aliens or spacemen. They just said these tall men and this thing, you know, this thing on the ground. I think one of the children still said this aeroplane. It wasn't an aeroplane, you know, because it would have been in pieces. There's no landing strip on this little hill. Yeah. But that was just, you know, the words flying saucer and aliens were not in their vocabulary. So that's why they stuck with this thing and these strange men. And I found it fascinating because this didn't, you know, we're not talking about Roswell here. We're not talking about Socorro, New Mexico. We're talking about a little mining town in West Yorkshire, a few miles from where I live. And that to me makes it all the more real. I know it doesn't in you know, in the wider world, but to me it does.
Same with me. When if people like this woman and their children talk about it, it makes it more believable.
Yeah, you know, I'm sat in her front room, in her living room, talking to her and the children. I used to have like a little kit bag that I always took with me, and in there was a tape recorder, notepad, camera and lenses and batteries. And I took my camera out, and my God, the look on her face, you know, because she hadn't done her hair, you know. So no way you're taking my photograph. So I think I better put that back in my bag, you know. But that reminded me of people I lived with. It was the same kind of, you know, people. I was born and raised in a similar community. So, you know, it all made sense to me. It really did.
Before I had my UFO sighting back in 1996, I saw a triangle with a little light in the middle, and it moved very fast and very strange in a Z shape or a zigzag shape, and within a second, within the blink of an eye, it was from there to there, and I don't know, crazy maneuvers. But if it wasn't for that, I don't think I would sit here today and talk about this stuff. I wouldn't believe it myself.
Yeah, well, I'd seen something prior to this, but this just confirmed it anyway. I hadn't seen anything prior to my involvement in the subject. It was only once I got involved that we managed to view something, you know, out of the ordinary. But this type of event, when it happens, it just confirms. People say, "Oh, you're wasting your time. You're daft. You're crazy." Well, no, I'm not wasting my time. I felt honored to sit in this lady's living room and listen to what she was telling me, as I have done with many other people as well. You know, I really do feel honored. Sadly, she's no longer with us, which I just found out, you know, a few years back. But the children are still there. So I've got 2 of them. Maybe I'll find the other 4 at some point. You never know.
UFO Landings UK. I will link your book in the description, of course, so people can buy it on Amazon, I guess. And where else can you buy it?
Mainly on Amazon. Just, you know, start with there. There may well be other places that stock it, but Amazon is always your best bet.
We've been talking a lot about dreams on the podcast lately, and we discussed if dreams could be a way to look behind the curtains of our so-called reality. And a lot of people say that lucid dreaming could be a way to travel through time or jump back and forth between dimensions or alternative realities or parallel universes. And maybe there's UFOs and aliens somewhere. Any deeper thoughts on this one?
Well, I mean, a gentleman who's regularly on television in the States is a chap called Professor Michio Kaku.
Yeah.
And I met him some years back when he was doing a book promotion here in the UK. He had a book, I believe it's called Hyperspace. And I went to interview him at his hotel. And he was an astrophysicist. And we talked about space travel and the fact that if we go in linear travel from A to B, it's a complete waste of time because the distances are too far. And we have limits as our species does. But he told me about the ways you could bend space, and therefore you could hop from one place to another in an instant. And we also even talked about other dimensions, which he was convinced of, and even time travel. And he said the only thing that was lacking for time travel was a power source. We'd need a power source equal to that of our own sun. But the theories for it to attempt it is certainly there. Now, of course, interstellar travel is a hot topic. Again, we mentioned before the James Webb telescopes, space telescopes photos shows you the immensity of the universe. And the thing is, we should add, that's the visible universe. So there is more of it out there that we're just not aware of. And I think the visible universe, Daniel, is something like 40 plus billion light years across. 2 trillion galaxies. Within each galaxy, zillions of stars and planets. I mean, it's mind-boggling. So I think we have to look at other subjects, other ways to think about the universe, rather than like we do. I get in my car and I drive to work. That is out of the window, I think, as far as space travel is concerned. So we have to look at bending space and time, maybe, or going through other dimensions and finding a way. And these were all the things that Professor Kaku was talking to me about back in the 1990s. And I think, that those UFO researchers that believe we are being visited by aliens are coming round to the fact that, well, if you look at UFO research to begin with, Daniel, if you go back to the 1950s, the contactee era said these were the Space Brothers coming to help us, and they would come from, first of all, they said the dark side of the moon. Well, we sent a probe around the moon, there is nothing there. Then they said, oh, well, no, it's Venus. We then learnt that the atmosphere of Venus is extremely toxic. And then they said, oh, Neptune or whatever, and then it became further and further out into the universe, which is all. So, our thoughts about where these things may have come from has developed, and we've realized that we can't come from one planet to another just traveling in a straight line. It would take zillions of years. So we have to look at other ways, and some of which you've mentioned there. For example, probably the most famous UFO case in the UK is the events that happened at Rendlesham Forest in December 1980. I won't go into it all, but basically on the first night of the incidents there, the forest was bordered by 2 Air Force bases. They were American Air Force bases, and they saw something descend into the forest. They sent 3 security. One stayed with the truck. The other 2, Jim Pennison and John Burroughs, went into the forest, and they saw this thing. Very peculiar thing, though. John Burroughs said it was about the size of a large car, was triangular shaped. It was either on the ground or perhaps, even on some legs. He said he walked around it, he touched it, it had red lights on top, blue lights underneath, it was warm, and it had these markings on the side. And he says that took him about 45 minutes. However, his colleague, who was standing just a few meters away, said all I could see was these strange lights. Now, John Burroughs has gone on to write his own book about his encounter, and I have no doubt both gentlemen did come across something extremely bizarre, but John believes it's not aliens, it is actually a vehicle from our future. It is us. It's time travel. So even some of the witnesses, I know John's probably out on his own there, but I dare say there will be others, but are thinking along those lines now. But because if you think about it, if you go back to Roswell, we've just gone past the 75th anniversary. You look at the creatures that were allegedly found there, well, they don't look too different from you and I, yeah. Daniel. So maybe they weren't from outer space, maybe, if you put time travel in there, I'm not saying they were, I'm just saying it's another way of looking at it, because we realize that if UFOs are from another planet, then it's highly unlikely that they're coming from point A to point B. It's just too far and would take too long. So we have to look at other ways, or other theories of what UFOs may be. Maybe nothing to do with aliens at all. Hence, you have time travel thrown into the equation, and lots of other things as well. There's lots of theories, but it's just a different way of looking at it. And why not?
I often think about the possibility of grace. We often talk about grace, and all we see is grace. And I often think about the possibility of grace are us from the future, as you stated, and maybe we changed into this because of, I don't know, the light changed, the pressure changed, everything changed around us because we destroyed the nature, we destroyed the planet, and they're here to tell us, don't do this.
Yeah,
good.
Well, again, if we look at certain abductees, and again, it's not all of them, it's a number of them, they will tell you the story about when they were taken on board these UFOs. They were shown pictures, films, visions of ecological disaster in Earth's future, not on their own planet, but here on Earth. This is what's going to happen to you in the future if you don't mend your ways. And I've worked with American abductee Calvin Parker, who with Charles Hickson was abducted in Pascagoula back in 1973. Calvin told me, he said, he don't like to talk about it because he calls it a curse. He said, Philip, I was shown horrible things, both past, present, and future. And it talked about, nuclear war or nuclear disaster, and he said, it's a curse. I didn't want to see these things. And it was shown to him while on board the UFO, but they were here on Earth. And, my first ever book, Daniel, was called Without Consent. It's all about abduction accounts and missing time cases here in the UK. I interviewed a young man, we'll just call him John, in Wales. And he was only a young fella, with long hair, like rock music. He was walking home one night when this incident happened to him. And again, they said to him, they showed him on a big screen, pictures of Earth being destroyed and what have you. And it had a very profound effect on him. And it was just an ordinary young fella, much like I was when I was his age. I had long hair and denims and liked rock music, And so he was another example. But one of my colleagues, who's no longer in the subject, he took a different look at this. He said, could we as humans all be psychic in some form or another? But some have more psychic abilities than others. Like some are better football players, like some are better artists, And these are messages being sent from our future back in time, are telling us we've got to change our ways. Otherwise, this is what we're going to let ourselves in for. And of course, if different dimensions are a reality, then we can prevent these things from happening in one or more of those dimensions.
Yeah.
So it's mind-boggling, I know, but it's all little different ways of looking at the same subject.
Yes.
So when people say, "Oh, do you believe in UFOs?" It's not really that simple. I always say yes, but it's not just black and white. I wish it was that simple. It would be. Yeah. It would be great.
Yeah, I always say yes too, but it's so much more than just some freaking creatures coming from outer space.
Yes, it is. It's much more complicated.
It's much more complicated. Yeah, it's sometimes not easy to explain.
Yes. Well, I'll give you another example. Nothing to do with UFOs. My mum, she's no longer with us, but originally when she was a youngster, she was born in Northern Ireland. And her and her mother and father and family lived in quite a rural part of the country. And when she was about 11 years old, she used to play down by the stream they had on the little farm they lived on. And she said to me, son, one day I went down to the stream and I met a fairy, a little female fairy, pretty clothes, wings. And she spoke to me. And she said, if you drink from this little bottle, you'll never have an accident. So my mother took this bottle and drank it. And she, you know, as I grew up, I asked her about this story. She told my children, you know, her grandchildren, the story. And somebody said to me, well, do you believe it? Do you believe your mother? I said, yes. Do you believe in fairies? No. But I believe my mum. Doesn't necessarily mean I believe in fairies. In other words, there may be different ways of looking at what my mum experienced that day. But I believe her. She told the truth as she knew it. Just like Mrs. Westerman, the children, told me the truth about what they'd seen that day. It wasn't a fairy. It was this strange thing with these three tall men outside of it, you know?
And now we have cases where people become contactees and they see, like in the case of a young man that told us his story in the podcast, who told us he saw Santa Claus, or people see owls or deers, or the guy I talked to, he said when he was a kid, he saw penguins stand around his bed watching.
Well, I'll give you another example. In my book, Without Consent, probably the best well-known abduction case in the UK involved a policeman who was on duty in his patrol car at the time. He was called Alan Godfrey. And he was on patrol in a town on the borders between West Yorkshire and Lancashire, a town called Todmorden. It was November 1980. Now, Alan was on a night shift on his own in his patrol car. He'd actually been looking for some cows that had gone missing. And just before he finished his shift, he saw an officer on foot patrol, so he stopped and had a chat. So I'm going to drive up and have one last look for these cows, and that's me finished. So he's driving up the main street. It's about 5:45 in the morning, so it's AM. And he's just going to turn off and go to the police station when he sees this light up ahead. You know, what's that? So he doesn't turn off, he carries on going. As he gets closer to it, there's an object blocking the road, literally blocking the road. It's shaped like a child's spinning top. It's dark. It's got a bank of windows or panels across the top. The bottom half is rotating. So Alan stopped the patrol car. He tried to radio through to the police station, couldn't get through. So he had a clipboard in his car. He took out the clipboard and began to draw this thing. Next thing he can remember, he's several hundred meters down the road, now driving the patrol car. No recollection of starting it up again. Turned around, this thing has gone. Now, where it had been on the road, it had been raining through the night. There was a dry patch. He got back to the police station. He was late. And when he changed out of his uniform, he noticed that his police boot was split underneath, which it hadn't been the night before, and he had a mark on the inside of his ankle. Cut a long story short, Alan reported the incident. About 6 months later, he linked up with UFO researchers by this time, and they hired 2 professional psychiatrists to put Alan under hypnosis, and they filmed it. Now, I've seen the film. Alan talks about seeing, first of all, a creature we call human. It's an old man with a little white beard and a skull cap on in a robe. He even had a name, call him Joseph. He then saw these ugly looking creatures that had heads shaped like an old-fashioned light bulb. But the strange thing, as you were mentioning, Alan's a very down-to-earth gentleman. He said, there's a dog. There's a black dog. A lot of people forget to mention that when they talk about Alan's case, but he says, there's a black dog.
That's quite interesting, because Preston Dennett. I have to mention him again. He also talked about a UFO case where a woman named Dolly was abducted and she was transported to the planet, so she claims. And she saw different species of aliens. Human-like aliens. She saw insectoids. She saw reptiloids. And she saw aliens. They looked like dogs or cats. That's interesting to mention it. So everything fits into the others somehow. It's
bizarre. But of course, we know through folklore and what have you that black dogs are well known. I mean, the Hound of the Baskervilles, a famous Sherlock Holmes story, although it's fiction, it's the phantom dog. You know, phantom dogs are well known in paranormal circles. But here we have an abductee, probably the most famous case of its kind in the UK. A police officer on patrol at the time, and during his hypnosis, he says, "I saw a black dog." And make of it what you will. It is extremely strange. I believe Alan himself will say, "Philip, I saw that thing on the road, and had I had a brick or a stone, I could have thrown it at it and it would have gone clunk." As for the hypnosis, he said, "Make of it what you will. I don't know." And I've seen the video of his hypnosis session, and it is very intriguing. It really is. But it's another bizarre aspect of the UFO phenomenon. It really is.
This makes me want to translate the story I told you about before from the young guy who talked to us. This makes me want to translate it into English and send it to you, because this young guy who told us that he's a contactee, a lifelong contactee, and he saw strange creatures like penguins, like Santa Claus and yada yada. And later on, they more and more turned into grays. They appeared as grays back later when he was an adult. But when he was a kid, as long as he was a kid, these creatures were penguins and stuff like that.
Well, let's think about this. I think just this week it has been, I think, the 25th anniversary since the movie Contact came out with Jodie Foster. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look, when she goes into that machine and off she goes into space, through another dimension, through a wormhole, and she finally lands at whichever star system she's at, I forget the name of it now, the beings appeared to her as her father, who's deceased.
Yes.
And they more or less say, if we appeared in our natural form, you wouldn't be able to understand us. So this is like we'll appear like this so you can understand, you can better understand. Is that something like what we're talking about with some of the abductees? I don't know. But that always stands out. I know that's a science fiction film and so on, but it always sticks in my memory when people say, "Well, it looked like this or it looked like that." It's almost as if it's making it familiar for you, so it doesn't scare the bejesus out of you. I don't know. It's just something that sticks in my mind, Daniel.
Yeah, that's crazy. The guy I was talking about, he also told us that he later on, when he was an adult, he had a meeting with his friends in the house of some other friend and yada yada. And long story short, they saw a dog. They did something with the Ouija board and stuff like this, and suddenly one of the girls was screaming because in the backyard a really big dog stood in the backyard and just looked into the window of the door and stared at the guys, and they stared at the dog, and someone said, "Who's that dog? Whose dog is this?" And the guy from the house said, "I don't know. I've never seen this dog before."
Yeah, well, there you go.
And it's really mind-blowing right now that you told me the story with the dog, and Preston Dennett told me a story about alien that appears as dogs, and this guy from Germany told me about his event with the dog. That's really strange and great at the same time.
Well, there you go. So it's just one of those things that we have. And trying to make sense of it is not always the easiest thing. So I think sometimes it's best just to say, this is what they reported. I've no reason to disbelieve them. Make of it what you will, come to your own conclusion. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, that's right. I was very skeptical when it came to abductions, but that changed. That changed because of stuff like that. You tell me this guy tells me this, and this guy tells me that, and everything fits perfectly in together.
Well, I'm the same. I wasn't skeptical. I just didn't know an awful lot about them. So how my first book, like I said, it's called Without Consent. It actually came about, my colleague who I co-authored the book with is a chap called Carl Negatis. Carl was a Fleet Street journalist of some distinction. And he set up on his own. And Carl and I were actually commissioned in the 1990s to write a treatment for a TV documentary about abductions in the UK. So I set about researching it with Carl, and in the end, they dropped the project. So we'd done all this research, and I said, well, it'd make a great book. So Carl says, yeah. So we went, on even further. And of course, in the early 90s, while we're doing this, there's no internet, there's no email. And so I would literally throw my stuff in the car. My wife would say, what time are you going to be home? I said, I don't even know what time I'm going to get there. And I went from one end of the country to the other, interviewing these abductees in person. Again, not all of them, but a lot of them. And it just convinced me that there was a genuine phenomena here. I'm not going to say it's aliens from wherever, because what we did at the end of it, we asked the abductees themselves, Daniel. It's okay, it's you that's had these experiences, not me. What do you think they were? Some said definitely aliens. Others thought it was some kind of spiritual experience. Others didn't have a clue. So even the abductees didn't know. Now, in my book, UFO Landings UK, I didn't intend to put an abduction case in there, but there's a couple, because they're also landings as well. And one is a lady from lives near Manchester called Linda Jones. And it's a long story, so I won't go into it. But when I asked Linda, what was your experience like? She was with her children at the time. The one word she used, Daniel, and it at the time it brought hairs up on the back of my neck. She said it was biblical.
Oh. And
I thought that was the last thing I was expecting. I mean, Linda's a lovely, lovely lady. I've met her several times, and her family, her husband and children. That was the last thing I expected Linda to say. I thought she was going to say it was aliens or something, or Doctor Who, or but biblical. So that is in my new book as well, and it it is emphasized, that word biblical.
I have to look up this one. Sounds interesting.
Yes, it is. It's fascinating.
Many people claim that they are sure that ETs are not here to harm us. President Dennett says this all the time. People say ETs are not here to harm us. What's your opinion on this one? Do you think that ETs want to help us and teach us, like many people claim? Or
there used to be two schools of thought, if you believe that aliens are ETs in the first place.
Yes.
So sort of the two pioneers at the time, one got more recognition than the other. The first one was Bud Hopkins from New York. Mm. And then you had Dr. David Jacobs from Temple University. Bud was of the opinion that they were here to help and assist or whatever. Dr. Jacobs was of the opposite. He believes that they have ill intent and they're not here to do us any favors whatsoever. And they both were good friends and colleagues. In fact, when Bud passed away, his whole archive of material was donated to Dr. Jacobs. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Jacobs has it in storage. That's how good friends they were, but they were completely opposite when it came to what their conclusions were. And I've corresponded with Dr. Jacobs. I've never met him. I've spoken to him on Skype. I met Bud several times. Bud even came and stayed with me. that's what I say to people, Daniel. Look at the data, look at the information, and draw your own conclusions. You don't necessarily have to listen. Well, who am I to tell you? You know, I'm just an ordinary guy from a coal mining community. But have a look, keep an open mind, and decide for yourselves.
I don't think you're just an ordinary guy.
and you know, I mean, one of the cases that I was working on for the book Without Consent, Bud actually assisted me with it. It was a lady who had a series of events. So it wasn't just a one-off, and they were ongoing. And I would transcribe my interviews with her, and I would mail them in the post, no email, mail them in the post to Bud. And he would come back and say, ask her this question and that question and this question. And I did. And I was very grateful for his assistance. But what to make of it all, you know, I really don't know. I'll give you one example that made me think. I published 2 books by a Romanian scientist. He's called Dr. Dan Farkas. His first book is UFOs over Romania, a great book. But at the end, he mentions his own conclusion, but only in, you know, a small way. So I said, right, let's have a book all about your conclusion on UFOs. And it's called Hypercivilizations. Basically, what Dr. Farkas believes is that, yes, we are being visited by beings from another world, but they are not a few thousand years in front of us, not even tens of thousands of years in front of us. They are perhaps millions and millions of years in front of us. They are so advanced, Daniel, that they are there right in front of our face. And we, as humans, are too stupid on the evolutionary scale to notice. And he gives an example. He says, you take a television, put it in an ant's nest. The ants will know it's there. They'll crawl all over it. The soldier ants may even try and attack it. But never, ever in a zillion years will we be able to figure out where it come from, what it's made of, what its purpose is, you know. And it'll be an ongoing thing because it's still there. And that's what Dr. Farkas thinks about the UFO phenomenon. We are too stupid on the intergalactic evolutionary scale to comprehend what's happening. And one of the abductees in my first book, Without Consent, called John Day. John's encounter happened in the 70s in Aveley in Essex. And I tracked him down many years later and managed to get an interview with him. And at the end of it, I said to John, all right, John, what happened to you that day? Is this nuts and bolts aliens from wherever, you know? He says, Philip, not only do I not have the words in my vocabulary, we as a species don't have them. He says, the best way I can describe the experience to you, he says, if you went to a film set, you know, Elstree or Pinewood or wherever they make them in Hollywood, they build a set. It's made of wood. You know, you go up, you touch it, knock on it, it's real. But when you look round the back of it, it's not real, is it? It's all an illusion. And he says, that's the best way I can describe what happened to us. And that was a very profound comment to me, Daniel, and I still don't necessarily understand it today, but it's kind of like what Dr. Farkas was saying, in a way, I think, you know, and I was, you know, I've never met John again. I wish I could. I would still like to have said, well, explain that to me again, would you please, John? You know, but it was very profound. And it's like, you know, I used to be a conference organizer, and we had a conference all about abductions. And our keynote speaker was Whitley Strieber, author of Communion. Mm-hmm. It was the first time he'd lectured on the subject in the UK, and he put on a terrific presentation. And then we did a Q&A, question and answers. One person said, are we getting any closer to the truth, Whitley? And Whitley says, we're learning to ask better questions. And I'll never forgot that, He's forgotten it. I've spoken to him about it, and he can't remember saying that. But he said, we're learning to ask better questions. And it's always stuck there. And I thought, how right he is. So the more we learn about the subject, Daniel, we learn to then ask better questions. We don't necessarily find the answers, but we then, learn to ask better questions. And so those two things have always stayed with me, plus many other things as well, of course. But
yeah,
they were sort of very profound things that were said, and hopefully will always stick in my head.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's great thoughts. Great thoughts. Made me think. Do you have any knowledge about cattle mutilations in your? Is there something in your book about?
No, it's not something I've ever got involved in. I looked into it initially because we had Linda Moulton Howe, who began her career in the sort of paranormal field with cattle mutilations when she was a TV producer, and we had her come lecture for us. And for me, I don't think there's anything to it as far as this subject is concerned. Mm-hmm. So I left it at that. It's like, we have crop circles. It's still in the UK. When they first hit the headlines in the 1980s, I went down to Wiltshire to look at some of these crop circles, and I measured them and I took photographs of them, but I wasn't impressed. And I may be wrong. I'm not saying I'm right. It wasn't for me. So, and the same was with cattle mutilation. So I'd have to say I know virtually nothing about them whatsoever. So, that's it.
Yeah, I'm pretty skeptical when it comes to this subject. The same with crop circles. This topic gives me nothing. I don't know. It's could be, might be, yada yada. I don't know, but
it's not my cup of tea. So I've left them alone. I'll let others argue about that.
Same here. There are reports from South America. I think I'm not recall where exactly that was, but there are reports from South America where UFOs shot beams of light at people. Some have even died, I heard. It is said that some have even died.
Well, if you want to look at cases that are bizarre, then South America and Brazil in particular is a place to go. It really is. Again, I published a book by my colleague Tiago Tichetti from Brazil, UFO contacts in Brazil, and it is full of them. It is absolutely full of the most bizarre incidents. So what this tells me is this: if you also then look at cases from around the world, country by country, you will see that there is a cultural influence on the way the phenomena is reported. Here in the UK, we have a mixture of all kinds of things where, like the people that live here come from all over the world. You look at Russia, some of the landing cases there, well, the aliens are these great big things, pretty much like the Russians want to portray themselves as the big Russian bear. I'm big, tough, and strong. Well, the aliens are the same. In Latin America, they are a little bit different. In Scandinavia, they're a little bit different. In South America, they're very different. But if you take out the visuals from these things, Daniel, the parameters that make up these encounters are the same no matter where you go around the world. So there is a cultural influence on the phenomena. That's why some skeptics of the extraterrestrial hypothesis look at these experiences, we'll call them. They look at it from a folklore perspective, because the way stories are told around the world, we all have versions of the same story, but it's influenced by our culture. Santa Claus is one example. The red and white Santa Claus we have now comes from a Pepsi-Cola advertisement, whereas before he used to wear skins, furs. So the way we perceive Santa Claus is influenced by our culture. And there'll be different stories of Cinderella and, same story, but it's slightly different. And it's the same with the encounters, the UFO encounters. Same types of stories, but they are influenced culturally. Why that is, you know, that's a whole different argument, but it is a fact. If you want to take time to look at that, it is a fact.
Mm. That's interesting. I always thought that UFOs in general, when you look at pictures in older books from the 70s or 60s or 50s, UFOs always look like you would expect them to look like in the 50s or in the 70s, a little bit like our furniture looked in the 70s, futuristic and the culture. Yeah.
But well, let's go back, because again, we've just gone by the 75th anniversary of Kenneth Arnold.
Mm-hmm.
Kenneth Arnold didn't see flying saucers. They were boomerang shaped. They were delta, no wings, no fuselage, no cockpit, but they were delta. It's only when he landed and spoke to a journalist, the journalist said to him, "How did these things move through the sky?" And he says, "Like skipping a saucer on a pond." And hey, presto, flying saucers were born. But he didn't see a saucer. Now, had Kenneth Arnold said, like skipping a stone on a pond, like I'm sure you've done as a kid or at the sea, then flying saucers would never have existed. Wouldn't have called them flying stones, would you?
Maybe.
But that's just the way the culture, and then so everybody's then seeing flying saucers. But we know from Kenneth Arnold, he didn't actually, that's not what he reported.
Mm-hmm.
So it shows you how culture, popular culture especially, influences the way these things are reported.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I always wondered why they look like they look 70s, 80s, 90s.
Yeah, but look now, do we get anything like that reported now? Somebody said to me on an interview, I think it was last year, and I couldn't answer it. And they said, "Where have all the Space Brothers gone?" I had no idea. I had no answer for that question, because they were the in thing in the 1950s, you know, and they're gone. And then it moved on into the 60s. We had Betty and Barney Hill.
Yes.
With the first abductions. Betty and Barney did not see the little grey guys. I corresponded with Betty. I didn't know that, you know, I just corresponded with her. She called him the UFO guys, the UFO men. They were little men with big eyes, and they wore a uniform, not dislike, you know, a military. They weren't the little grey guys. They came along later. So where the hell did they come from? You know? And then in the 70s, we had Pascagoula, the creatures that Charlie and Calvin saw are like nothing that anyone else has ever reported. Then we had then we had Travis Walton, big case, still hotly debated now, but Travis saw two different types of creatures, things that were pretty similar to the Hills, and others that were human, but they had, you know, these goldfish balls on their head. But now it's, you know, what's in vogue now, Daniel? The tic-tac. So it's tic-tac here, tic-tac there. In the 90s, 80s and 90s, it was the triangles. What year did you see the flying triangle?
It was a triangle in the 90s, 1996.
There you go. There you go. But now, all everybody wants to talk about is tic-tacs and the US government. So you can see how the UFO subject has evolved since its inception with Kenneth Arnold. We'll take that as a starting point, even though it's not. That's when the term flying saucer came into our vocabulary. And you can see how it's evolved down the decades and will continue to do so. I mean, 50 years' time, it was something completely different, Daniel. I won't be here, you might be, but it was something completely different. The UFO subject is very different now from the day when I started in 1980.
I don't think I'm here in 50 years, but I know what you're referring to.
You know what I mean?
It's, yeah, like 10 years back, and sometimes even now, there was ball of lights. People saw ball of lights. That parted.
Yeah. But now, MUFON have just announced that they're no longer going to investigate sightings of orbs, of strange lights.
Orbs?
Orbs, yeah, balls of light. Call them what you will, but, you know, they're not going to investigate them.
But why?
because they think it's a waste of time, because they're not aliens. I don't know. You'd have to ask Mufon, but that's come out in the last few weeks. Now, when it comes to strange lights, you know, that's what got me my first investigations. We had areas in and around what's called the Yorkshire Dales National Park in North Yorkshire, lots of these strange lights. They're still appearing in Hessdalen in central Norway.
Yes.
You have the Mantle lights in Texas. You have the Min lights in Australia. You know, so, you know, to call them, just to say we're not going to investigate them, but they might have come to the conclusion that these things are natural formations or they're plasmas or whatever. Therefore, they're of no interest because they're not aliens.
Mm-hmm. We got some fireballs or light balls in the Mekong in Thailand, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Everywhere,
yeah.
And again, around the world, it's the same thing, just a different name.
Talking about lights, and that's the last thing I want to talk about today, since I have you here. Since we talked about lights, what do you think? Is there a connection between the UFO phenomenon and the paranormal? Or, I don't know, maybe, let's say, ghosts and haunted?
I would say yes. I would hazard a guess that they're all different sides of the same coin.
The same kind?
Yeah, it's a coin. You know, it's the same sides, you know, different sides of the same coin. I give you a coin. It's got a picture on one side, and you turn it over and it's completely different, but it's the same thing.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example why. We had this area in North Yorkshire that had a lot of UFO sightings. It was around a little village called Carlton. It's just a nothing little place, very nice, very quaint. Above it was the moors. And there's nothing on them of any interest. But in and around these hills and moors, we had a lot of UFO sightings, on which we concentrated. But then when we started going to speak to people, I'll give you our first clue. A gentleman wrote to us from a small village. And for whatever reason, we decided to go and speak to him. It was about an hour and a half's drive. When we got there, what we thought was a village was only about 8 houses. And we got his letter, but none of the houses had a number on them. So we didn't know which one was his house. So we knocked on the first door and he said, "Excuse me, can you tell me where Mr. So-and-so lives?" And this lady, and I still remember her, she said, "Have you come about the ghost dog?" No. So she told us about these 2 red lights that would float along, and they were the eyes of the ghost dog. But of course, all they were seeing were these strange lights. So we went to Mr. So-and-so's house, and he told us about these strange lights. Now, we happened to have a member of our society who was a police officer in the area. He witnessed the phenomenon himself, but he also went on to tell us, for example, him and his partner got called out to a burglary one night. And he turns up at this couple's house and he said, "Okay, what's been stolen?" And he said, "Well, nothing." And he said, "Well, what do you mean nothing?" He said, "Well, we've been out for the evening, and when we've come in, lots of our ornaments and pictures have just been turned upside down.
Oh.
There's no windows broken. The door was locked. There's no sign of somebody breaking in. Just all these strange things. It's just, like the vase turned upside down, picture on the wall turned upside down, and other things." And he said, "Well, it's not a burglary, is it? Nothing's been stolen." He said, what am I supposed to do?" And he then got called out to another, this is not at the same time, it's in the same area. And he said there was a fire. So he said, "We got there before the fire brigade. And you can see it through the window, there's an illumination." So he says, "What we're taught to do is we kick the front door in and we go down on our hands and knees because the heat rises. And then you proceed, if possible, on your hands and knees. And he said, I went into this house on my hands and knees, and there's a man in the living room lying flat on his back, and there is a flame coming out of his torso. Nowhere else.
Like a real flame, or
a real flame?
But he was not burning, like...
Nothing else was on fire. There's just this flame coming out. He's dead. There's a flame coming out of his torso. And he said, spontaneous human combustion.
Okay, spontaneous human combustion. Okay, so he died. He was
dead, yeah. Now, then what we did in this area, we housed a caravan on the moors for a week. And we did some local publicity, and we encouraged people to come and report their sightings to us. And they did. One of the unusual ones was an elderly couple. Now, at this point in time, Daniel, in this area, there was no major supermarket. So they would go once a fortnight, so once every 2 weeks, they would take a drive out to a supermarket. It was about an hour away. They'd always go the same route, same day. They're coming back one night from the supermarket. Well, look, they built a factory in that field. Sat back in the field, there is this object shaped like that with all these windows, all glowing, all lit up. And they thought, whatever they're making, they're in full production. Of course, 2 weeks later, they went on the same trip. And guess what? There's no factory there. And we sat them down in this caravan with a map, and they showed us the route on which they go. So we actually drove that route in daylight and had a look, and there is no factory there. So what we realized was, yes, these strange lights were being seen in these areas, and I saw them myself, but also all these other weird and wonderful things in the same areas. Now, I published a book by a gentleman called Trey Hudson, James Trey Hudson. It's called The Meadow Project. And basically, you've probably heard of the Skinwalker Ranch.
Yeah, of course.
Trey and his colleagues are paranormal researchers. And they've been looking at this area in the south of the United States. They haven't given the location away. What they would do on the map, they put over the top of the map a clear piece of what we call acetate, plastic. And they would mark on it instances where strange creatures have been seen. Take that off, put another piece of clear plastic where UFOs have been seen. Take that off for whatever, paranormal happenings. Then they put all the plastic pieces together. And guess what? Both the strange creatures and the hauntings and the UFO sightings were all grouped in the same general areas. Same, different sides of the same coin.
Now it makes sense.
But we only found that out by mistake, knocking on somebody's door, asking for where this gentleman lived, and they said, come about the ghost talk. And we then realized that there were other things happening that we hadn't asked. We just come, you had a UFO sighting, yeah, what time was it? What did you see? You know, and we were gone. So once we learned that, we then learned to say, well, you know, everything else been seen around here, you know, and it's amazing what you find out. It really is. So when you say, are the paranormal and UFOs linked? I would say definitely. But some people would disagree with that, but then that's fine.
I have heard a lot about people that saw a UFO shortly after, or sometimes even while they had a haunted experience of some kind, or a ghost encounter, if you like this.
Yeah.
Many people saw blue lights coming from somewhere while they saw a ghost or something like that.
Absolutely.
Always light.
We'll call it the blue lady. But when you boil it down, all they've seen is this strange blue light. Mm. And then the culture takes over, and it's not just a blue light. Oh, it must be the blue lady. But what they actually saw was just a blue light.
Yeah.
I told you about Calvin Parker and Charlie Hickson, their close encounter.
Blue lights.
Blue light was the first thing that they saw. You know, was these blue lights coming from behind them.
I remember I also talked to Calvin Parker not too long ago, and he couldn't talk that good because of his tongue. And he told me about the blue lights. I was impressed by his story. He's a great guy, by the way. He is
indeed. He is indeed.
Great guy.
So, you know, I would say, yes, there are connections. But others would disagree, of course. But that's fine, no problem.
Philip, I have so many more questions, but we have to have a cut somewhere. So let's end this here for today. And yeah, maybe we can meet again and have another talk.
Why not, Daniel? So it's been a great pleasure talking to you in lovely Bavaria.
Yeah, Bavaria, in Franconia.
Well, it's nothing like Bavaria where I live. This used to be an industrial town. So it's nothing like Bavaria. So I'm very envious.